What thing do you think matters to you the most? For some, it's family, the unbreakable bonds of love and support. For others, it's friendships, the people who make life feel less lonely. And then there are those who place their meaning in possessions, achievements, or even a dream they've chased for years. But do these things really matter? How often have you held onto something so tightly, believing it to be the very foundation of your happiness, only to realize later that its significance faded like a forgotten melody? What do you think causes this shift? Is it time, perspective, or the brutal truth that meaning itself is nothing more than an illusion? Now, what if I told you that nothing, absolutely nothing, matters? That everything you do, every goal you strive for, every love you cherish is ultimately meaningless? Would you call it bleak, or would you call it liberating? The philosophies we're about to unravel may seem dark, but they are also brutally honest. They strip away the comforting illusions we cling to and expose reality in its rawest form. If you crave unfiltered truth, the kind that shakes the very foundation of how you see life, then stay with me. This journey will change everything. Albert Camus, the philosopher of the absurd, stood at the crossroads of human longing and cosmic indifference. He saw existence as a cruel joke, one without a punchline, a script, or a purpose. We, fragile and desperate creatures, search for meaning in a universe that responds only with silence. We cry out into the void, demanding answers, but the abyss does not answer back. Instead, it yawns, indifferent and eternal. And so, in the myth of Sisyphus, Camus gives us the image of a man sentenced to the most futile of labors, pushing a boulder up a hill, only to watch it tumble back down, over and over, without end. A symbol of all human effort. A reflection of our own endless striving. And yet, in this bleakness, Camus dares to utter a defiant paradox: we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because in embracing absurdity, in spitting in the face of cosmic indifference, we reclaim agency. We make a choice. We acknowledge that there is no higher order, no divine decree, and yet, we continue, unbroken, unbowed. That, Camus insists, is true rebellion. Friedrich Nietzsche went even further, delivering what was, perhaps, the most earth-shattering pronouncement in all of philosophy: God is dead. Not merely a theological statement, but a diagnosis of the human condition. If once we derived meaning from a celestial script, from divine commandments that ordered the universe, then with God's death, we are left alone, adrift in an ocean of nothingness. There is no cosmic judge, no grand design, no predetermined fate. But for Nietzsche, this was no tragedy, it was an opportunity. The weak would scramble to construct new illusions, clinging to religion, nationalism, or empty morality to shield themselves from the abyss. But the strong, the rare, the fearless, would rise as creators, forging their own values. The Übermensch, the overman, would stare into the void and, rather than retreat, would will new meaning into existence. But how many are willing to bear such a burden? How many can face the abyss and not flinch? Arthur Schopenhauer, however, held no illusions about human strength. He saw us not as heroes, not as defiant creators, but as prisoners of a relentless and unyielding force, the will. Not the rational, goal-driven will of the Enlightenment, but an unconscious, insatiable drive that compels all life. We are creatures of desire, bound to an endless cycle of yearning and suffering. The moment we attain what we seek, the hunger begins anew. We chase, we grasp, we momentarily clutch some fleeting satisfaction, only to feel it dissolve in our hands. There is no escape, no final arrival, no true contentment, only an endless treadmill of longing. And so, Schopenhauer saw but one solution: renunciation. The wisest among us, he believed, are those who abandon the struggle, who sever themselves from desire itself, who retreat into the serenity of detachment, much like the Buddhists who preach the cessation of craving. But who among us is truly willing to surrender the world? Who has the strength to turn away from life itself? Jean-Paul Sartre took a different path, one that was not built on resignation but on radical freedom. If there is no divine plan, no inherent purpose, then we are, in his words, condemned to be free. There is no fate, no destiny, no guiding hand to tell us what to do or who to be. The weight of existence falls upon our shoulders alone. We must choose, and in choosing, we define ourselves. But this freedom is not a gift, it is a terrifying responsibility. Most people, when confronted with the abyss of choice, recoil. They would rather surrender to external authorities, adopt prepackaged identities, let society dictate their paths. They live in what Sartre called bad faith, pretending that they have no choice, that their roles are predetermined. But to truly embrace existentialism is to own one's decisions, to forge oneself anew every moment. A liberation, yes, but a heavy one. And then there is Søren Kierkegaard, the melancholic Dane who wrestled with faith and despair, who saw existence as a paradox. For Kierkegaard, life was not merely absurd but agonizingly personal. The individual stands alone before the universe, burdened with the dread of existence. We are not just meaningless, we are painfully aware of our own meaningless. But unlike Nietzsche, who rejected God, or Camus, who embraced absurdity, Kierkegaard saw a leap of faith as the only escape. Not a rational faith, not a dogmatic belief, but an irrational, passionate leap, a defiance of reason itself. To believe, despite everything, despite absurdity, despite doubt. And in that act of belief, to find meaning where none should exist. But who among us has the courage to believe against all evidence? Who can leap into the unknown and find solace? The Russian existentialists, like Fyodor Dostoevsky, saw this struggle not in abstract philosophy but in the raw torment of the human soul. His characters wrestled with nihilism, with guilt, with redemption, with the unbearable weight of freedom. Raskolnikov, the murderer in Crime and Punishment, seeks to prove himself beyond morality, to transcend good and evil, only to crumble under the weight of his conscience. Ivan Karamazov, in The Brothers Karamazov, declares that, if God does not exist, everything is permitted, but can we truly live with such permission? Dostoevsky understood that the death of meaning is not just an intellectual problem but a deeply human one that gnaws at the very core of our being. Émile Cioran, the philosopher of doom, did not simply reject optimism, he eviscerated it. To him, existence itself was a disease, a grotesque mistake of the universe. The act of being born, he declared, was the greatest catastrophe, for it condemned us to a life of absurdity, suffering, and slow decay. Every breath was borrowed time, every joy a fragile illusion poised on the brink of despair. He did not argue for death, nor did he champion nihilism as a liberating force, he merely saw life as an insult that none of us had consented to. In his world, hope was not a virtue but a poison, a delusion that kept humanity shackled to the lie that tomorrow might be better. But tomorrow, like today, would rot and wither, just as we all must. He saw no redemption in love, no salvation in ambition, no cure in philosophy itself. To read Cioran is to stare into the abyss and feel it gaze back, not with malice, but with indifference. David Hume, the consummate skeptic, did not merely question reality, he dismantled it piece by piece. The idea of a stable, coherent self, an unchanging I that persists throughout life, was to him a mirage. When we look inward, we find no fixed core, no fundamental essence, only an ever-changing flow of thoughts, emotions, and sensations. We are but a series of flickering moments, as disconnected as beads on a string with no thread to bind them. Hume's radical empiricism cut deep, leaving behind an unsettling conclusion. If there is no true self, then what does it mean to live, to act, to suffer? If we are nothing more than transient bursts of consciousness, does anything truly matter? His philosophy offered no comforting answers, no warm reassurances of a deeper truth lurking beneath the veil of perception. Instead, it left us stranded in a world where meaning was a construct, stitched together by habit and illusion, destined to unravel the moment we dared to look too closely. Martin Heidegger did not merely remind us of death, he forced us to confront it, to feel its cold breath on our necks, to recognize its looming presence in every moment. He spoke of being toward death, a term that stripped away all distractions and demanded raw authenticity. We do not live in the abstract, we exist in the shadow of our own mortality, each heartbeat a countdown, each decision a step toward the grave. And yet, rather than embracing this truth, most people bury themselves in triviality, drowning in entertainment, in routine, in the shallow comforts of the everyday. They fear the weight of their own finiteness, avoiding the stark reality that life has only one conclusion. Heidegger's philosophy is not one of despair, but of brutal clarity. To live authentically is to live with death in mind, to make choices not as one who has infinite time but as one who walks a narrow path, with the abyss just beyond the edge. The 14th century Black Death was not simply a tragedy, it was a reckoning. It tore through Europe with a ruthless efficiency, erasing entire families, entire towns, entire ways of life. Priests fell alongside peasants, nobles alongside beggars. Death did not discriminate, and neither did the plague. In the face of such senseless destruction, the very foundations of meaning began to crack. What justice could there be in a world that allowed such suffering? What divine order could permit such chaos? Some turned to faith, desperately clinging to the idea that God's will, though inscrutable, must have a purpose. Others sought answers in self-inflicted pain, believing that through suffering, they might expiate the sins of a doomed world. And yet, the plague was deaf to their prayers, blind to their sacrifices. It did not punish, it did not forgive. It simply was. And when it passed, it left behind a Europe forever changed, where the certainty of meaning had been replaced with a gnawing, unanswerable question. So where does that leave us? If nothing matters, if meaning is an illusion, what do we do? Camus tells us to rebel, to laugh in the face of the absurd. Nietzsche tells us to create our own meaning. Sartre tells us to embrace the weight of freedom. And Choron? He just laughs at it all. Maybe nothing matters. But maybe, just maybe, that's what makes life truly free. You don't have to follow rules that were never real. You don't have to chase dreams imposed upon you. You can just be. Does the void scare you, or does it set you free? Let me know in the comments. This is the Beyond the Surface channel. If you want more unfiltered philosophy, subscribe, because sometimes, the darkest truths are the ones worth knowing. Thank you for watching.